Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. What recent progress has he made on catching up with Australia?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, in terms of catching up with Australia on behalf of the Prime Minister, the biggest step we have made is returning the economy to growth after 5 quarters of economic contraction that started under Labor. The second biggest step we have taken is to start undoing the damage done by wrong-headed economic policy of the previous Labor government. As the member will know, the Australian economy did not go into recession at all, so we've been starting from some way behind.
Mr Speaker, supplementary question. How many net additional jobs does he expect to see created in New Zealand this year, compared with the 250,000 new net additional jobs that Australia has so far created this year?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can't give the member that number, but I can say that when Australia has had its terms of trade double in 5 years because of the value of its resource base, up against our commodities whose terms of trade have increased by about 50%, of course there is going to be a challenge. And equally, we had a recession and they didn't. And that member's party might be able to explain why New Zealand went into recession under that government before the global financial crisis and Australia didn't.
Mr Speaker, supplementary. Will the first decline in the median income in New Zealand to take place in more than a decade, which Statistics New Zealand recorded over the last year, help close the income gap with Australia?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, when the member was away, we discussed in the House how useless the median income measure was, because it doesn't measure what happens to household incomes. But, Mr Speaker, that member ought to explain how his party managed to drive New Zealand into recession when the Australian economy did not go into recession. He was in the government at the time.
Chris Tremaine.
Supplementary question. How have wages in New Zealand fallen behind those in Australia?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, well, the history of this is quite interesting. Between September 1999 and September 2008, real after-tax wages in New Zealand rose only 3%. In contrast, in the same period in Australia, real after-tax wages rose 19%. So over the last decade, wages in New Zealand fell a long way behind wages in Australia. Since that time, I'm happy to say that we have made progress towards reducing the wage gap, but it's early days yet.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. When will the unemployment rate in New Zealand, which has reached nearly 1 in 2 for Maori and Pacifica teenage girls and over 1 in 3 for Maori and Pacifica teenage boys, persuade him that he needs to give the same priority and focus to skill training and education to our young people at risk, instead of cutting, as he did last week, $55 million out of skill training?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member may not be aware that in the industry training system, about 100,000 people who are participating in it were getting no credits whatsoever. And with the agreement of the industry training sector, the government has taken the unutilised and wasted money and shifted it to where it can be more usefully employed.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. When putting together his tax package, what consideration did he give to ensuring that most of the benefit went to those on modest incomes, as they did in Australia, rather than the lion's share of the benefit going to the top incomes, as he did in New Zealand?
The Honourable
Well, Mr Speaker, the member is simply wrong, and the fact that he repeats that description, including in Australia, doesn't mean he's right. The government published all the analysis with respect to the equity of the tax cuts after the budget, and it showed that when you take into account the impact of the increased taxes on property and on foreign owners of New Zealand assets, the major income groups all got about the same positive increase in income. That's the analysis, and the opposition, in fact, no one has challenged it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Which of the policies introduced by his government has done the most to widen the income gap with Australia?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, as we pointed out, the real after-tax wage gap has actually closed. And that is the measure that is used, that was legislated by the previous government as the wage measure that's relative to national superannuation. And we believe that our whole raft of policies, including our investment in infrastructure, our microeconomic reform, our tax switch, our reform of the public sector, our focus on education and skills, and our extension of innovation and business support are all adding up to a policy that will close the gap with Australia.
A supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Has he passed the test that he set for himself to close the gap with Australia, or was that promise about as credible as his promise not to increase GST?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes, our policies do pass the test. We have put together a 6-point economic program which we are executing, and I might say ours is a program that his new friend Mrs Gillard would recognise, because she gave a speech a lot like ours, and his policies are headed in the opposite direction where his new friend Mrs Gillard is going.
Question number 4, Te Uroroa Flavel. Order.